Well, welcome. As always, thank you so much for choosing to spend your valuable time with us here today. I know in these busy times, we really have to prioritize and value where we spend our time. So I'm always very humbled when you choose to spend it here. And I strive to make sure we give you as much value as possible to make it worthwhile. And today you're in for a real treat. We're going to be chatting today with author Gwen Tuinman about negotiating women's voice and power, including feminine rage and resilience, both then, historically, and now. So, welcome, Gwen. I am so excited to have you here and looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on, Cindy. It's a delight to be here.
And for those of you who may not know her yet, you're going to want to rush out and get her book. Gwen is the author of Unrest, which is being put out by Random House. And it's a 19th century feminist adventure, you could say, set against the gritty Bytown frontier, with Bytown, of course, being the former Ottawa. And the National Post calls Unrest an edgy adventure yarn about women's freedom. And it is so much more than that. And Gwen's descended from Irish tenant farmers and English Quakers. She's got an interesting historical background herself. And her storytelling influences include a lot of soul searching, she says, an interest in bygone days, and the complexity of living a life, and fascinated by the landscape of human tenacity. And let's hope you all have that. She writes around women navigating the social restrictions of their era. I just finished the book. I absolutely loved it and can't wait to talk about that, women in power and using our voice, and unpack some of that. So, Gwen, having just read Unrest myself, it really struck me how rich it is with the themes about women navigating systems that really restrict them. And I was wondering what drew you to that theme. It struck me, or maybe you didn't intend that, but it struck me as sort of an overarching theme for the book. What drew you to that?
hmm Well, those are particular challenges that women in the 19th century and like across all ages have really had to deal with. As a writer, when we study craft, we're often told about the hero's journey. It's the heroic character reluctantly going on a journey, and they have to go to a quest to another world. They need to conquer something,
Yeah.
and but it's always something. It's generally something external to themselves. But women's journey in story is very different. A woman's journey through story is not always going out and conquering something external, but conquering something internal
Yeah.
and overcoming that hurdle of realizing the power and the worth and credibility she has in herself, and then conveying that to other people in her sphere, in her world, so that they accept her as well and pay attention to her voice. And I'm very interested in that. I'm particularly interested in how, as you mentioned in the lovely introduction, how women navigate their particular era, the patriarchy and social restrictions that are placed upon them. And so it just seemed like a really good match for the kind of story I wanted to tell, to take a female character through that sort of arc, from
Yeah.
that beginning of being voiceless to the point where she has voice. And something I find really interesting is that although women have always made up 50% of the Earth's population, and sometimes a little bit more actually,
Yeah.
still we're not represented in 50% of the historical record.
Yeah.
And so there are actually feminist historians who are trying to recreate the story of women in history so that we have a better understanding of what their lives were like.
Yeah.
And they're trying to weave that into the historical text as
Yeah.
well, where women are missing.
I
And
love that.
so I suppose that all the while I'm a historical fiction author and someone who enjoys researching history, I'm not a historian myself, but I've come to understand that I'm kind of doing that same thing, but through the writing of historical fiction.
Yeah. Well, and
So,
it's like that her story, as they're calling it now. And it amazed me. I mean, Gina Davis has done a lot of work, some great work about underrepresentation of women in film, right? In Hollywood and
mhm.
historically, and how we need to change that. And it amazes me, you see in social media every day popping up now, these recognitions from the kind of research that you're probably talking about of women who achieved incredible things and inventors and authors and who never ever got credit for their own work and contributions. So
Yeah,
thank you for sharing
absolutely.
that.
The historical record was largely written by men. Well, it's written by men,
Yeah,
honestly,
yeah,
and written by men in position. And so history is, we have to ask ourselves what kind of lens history is
yeah,
written through.
yeah,
It's written through the lens of, men with economic means
yeah.
and power who, wanted things to reflect well on themselves.
Yeah.
And because of the social status that women held, they just weren't mentioned.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a digression, but I find it
No,
interesting.
that it,
I
it
thought
is
I
it's
would I
fascinating.
would mention it.
And it always interests me that, I mean, we need to start reconditioning that, even how works are received with female protagonists, because a lot of studies show that young boys and men, frankly, are much less likely to read a book with a female protagonist than women are to read books. So hopefully, as we start uncovering some of that history, it'll be more attractive to them. Now, what struck you most about the ways that women in sort of that 1836 Bytown world that you've created so vividly for us? What struck you most about the ways that the women had to, negotiate their identities or even their safety?
Sure. Well, social status had an awful lot to do with that, actually. There were women who, like merchant class and gentry level women who lived on one particular side of the Rideau Canal in Bytown, now known as Ottawa, and they were quite wealthy. And so they were really guarded by their husband's status, quite frankly. A lot of those women hired young women of a lower economic class who would come to work for them. Now, and so they had a lot of help in the household. And because they had a lot of help, then they had more extra time of their own to dedicate to socialite activities, which would further be an aid to cultivate their husband's identity, frankly, and and then that would play back into elevating their status and their safety, quite frankly. For women who were widowed, life was very difficult.
Yeah.
They weren't always able to inherit all of their husband's assets. And these were all terrible problems for lower middle and women from lower income
Yeah.
families, people who were suffering in poverty. A woman without a man at that time really suffered. If she went, door to door asking for help, she could be charged under the vagrancy laws, which my understanding is they were very vague, and so it could cast a wide net on people, and it could the consequence could even be a jail term, quite frankly.
Yeah. Captured that so beautifully in the book, Gwen. Like, I mean, the
Yeah.
Peg's character and I mean, the circumstances that women fell upon when they didn't have
Mhm.
that sort of male in their life. And I'm wondering, I was
Yes.
curious as I was sort of reading through it, what do you see as the parallels in the lives of women today? I mean, obviously there's been some shifts, but it struck me at least that in some ways we're still fighting those same fights on a different level. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
It's very true. So I'm thinking of Mariah right now.
Yeah.
Mariah was really stuck in her situation living with her sister's family. And just to add a little bit of background for listeners, Mariah had a child out of wedlock as a result of a tryst with her future brother-in-law. Then she traveled to Canada with her brother-in-law and sister with the understanding that her sister would raise Mariah's son as her own. And so, of course, there's a great deal of tension and angst and
Yes.
secret keeping in the home, which builds an awful lot of tension. But what I want to come back to is that Mariah was really held in place by the fact that she had a child in that home. And so that was Mariah's situation. There were a lot of other women who were enduring terrible things, domestic violence,
Yeah.
drunkenness, which was a very serious issue at the time, because in just early to mid 1800s, I guess, distilleries became more proficient. And so the alcohol level rose
Yeah.
in ale and such. And the water was very unsafe and people couldn't really drink it. And so it was very customary to drink ale. But then what happened is it begat a series of people with drinking difficulties, men with drinking difficulties, and the repercussions of that went right back onto the women.
Yeah.
And that is very much the same.
Yes.
It's the same kind of situation today with domestic abuse. It's a difficult phenomenon for some people
Yeah.
to understand why women don't leave, but there are economic considerations. There are considerations regards to children and situations involving and family that can make it very difficult to leave. So that's a bit of a parallel.
Yeah. And the power dynamic, right? I mean, we often don't talk about that.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
some of those practical considerations, but also there still exists, I think in many ways, this power differential that can make it really challenging for women
Yeah.
to trust
Yeah.
in their ability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, a little bit further to the issue with public drunkenness and, bringing and turning into violence in the home, there was the temperance movement.
Yeah.
And I just want to bring this up as another example of power and stifling women's voices as well. I know I've seen, and probably you have seen as well, movies or maybe shows like when we were growing up, where they would show a woman who was part of the temperance movement. And she was always some pinch faced little
Yes,
biddy, right?
that's
Making
true.
trouble and just ruining everybody's fun, right? But when you read the history, it was a real, genuine issue. And these women, they knew their stuff. They were serious activists. They organized. They not only addressed the alcohol and abuse issue, they were addressing other social issues
Yeah.
as well. But when they would raise these issues, particularly surrounding alcohol, they would be laughed at and
Yeah.
they would be mocked and they would be diminished.
Yeah.
And that was in the 1800s and early 1900s. And still in my childhood, like through the 60s and 70s, and even in the 80s, I remember well, still seeing those characters mocked
Yeah.
in in media.
That's a great
Mhm.
issue, but I've never thought of it in the context of the temperance movement. But as you were saying that, Gwen, it really struck home with me how much historically and today we diminish women's contributions in many ways, right? I mean, by
Mhm.
trivializing them or making the women seem
Mhm.
somehow less than. Now, your characters, your female characters, there's challenge there. So I'm wondering, what would you say about how your female characters challenge or submit, like on the one hand or the other, to the norms of their time, that sort of societal norms?
Hmm. Well, I've mentioned Mariah so
Yep.
I'll begin with her. Mariah was subordinate to her brother-in-law and to her sister and to society at large. She became her mode of coping is that she became very reclusive. She became very withdrawn, and she tended to just stay in the home. She was really afraid to go out in public. But the thing that drove her out of that was her love for her son, because she needed to go out into the world
Yeah.
to make a better situation for her son Thomas, who at the time of telling the story is about 17, just at that age where he has
Yeah.
figured the whole world out, right?
Yeah.
and
Or so
and
we
knows
think.
everything. Yeah. And I know Cindy is laughing because she's read the book and she knows that Thomas doesn't know everything and gets himself a real pickle.
Yeah.
And his biological mother, whom Mariah, needs to bail him out. So she was able to find her courage through that need to help him.
Yeah. And I must say, Gwen, I loved, and I think it's a testament to your skill as well. She was so terrified, and for our listeners, the main character, the protagonist, she was so terrified of men, given the historical circumstances and her personal experiences.
Mhm.
And then she goes into a logging camp. I don't want to give any spoiler alerts, but she goes into an environment, and many would have seen that to be such a stretch. But you built that character arc and the necessity so beautifully. And it was so exciting to root for her when she was able to cope in that environment. So
Mhm.
now I'm wondering, were
Mhm.
there particular moments where you found yourself reflecting on your own experiences or modern parallels?
Oh, certainly. It's a really funny thing. You can spend 3 years writing a book, and then not until it goes to the publisher and comes back to you do you realize that there are little notes of you through the book. And yes, I did not, the book is not about me in any way. But I really think that as creative people, when we write something, we're kind of figuring things out, probably what compels us to choose certain things for the story. So the arc of Mariah's story goes from being fearful to being pushed into the world and then being pushed further and realizing for the first time having the mental space to think about what it is that she wants out of life.
Yeah.
And then she goes for it. And once she goes for it, then the fulfillment that she desires and that she deserves, frankly, comes to her. And I have spoken before about the fact that before meeting my wonderful husband, Eric, whom I've been married to now for just over 26 years, I was married to someone else for about 12 years, and it was a very abusive situation, particularly mentally. And so what happens is that you become very compressed.
Yeah.
You are not thinking about what fulfills me as a human. What are my dreams and desires? Because your sole focus is to make everything in the other person's life really easy
Yeah.
so that you are not the recipient of negative behaviors with harmful impact. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
And so this is very much what Mariah was doing. And in the book, there's a line, something about the pain she feels of making herself small to
Yeah.
make other people comfortable.
Yeah. I love
And
that.
so, and I know a lot of people, and particularly a lot of women, can totally relate to that.
Yeah.
And so, in the same way that Mariah was pushed and Mariah moved forward, I too was pushed
Yeah.
and I moved forward. And at the end of well, I don't want to give away the end of the book,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I
No spoiler alerts.
yeah, but I can tell you that if I made my life an arc, that I had to grow and do a lot of homework and really push myself to do the things like that this writing career that brings me joy and fulfillment and brings me to have wonderful conversations with great people like you, Cindy, which is such a
Oh,
pleasure.
well, thank you.
Hmm.
And I want to really thank you, actually, Gwen, for being so open and vulnerable about your past experience. I think so many women carry that with a shame and a guilt, and they don't speak to it. And the fact that we don't speak to it more, in part, perpetuates the problem. So for our listeners out there, I want you to recognize the power of Gwen using her voice to share her story as a way not only to help others, but to lift herself up into a better place. And I'm wondering just the storytelling itself, Gwen, like, do you see storytelling as I think I call everything a negotiation in many ways, but do you see storytelling as a form of negotiation or a negotiation tool, right? Whether for your characters or for us as women reclaiming our voices? Because it strikes me you do that. You're sort of negotiating our identity through your storytelling. What are your thoughts on that?
That is such an interesting insight. And yeah, I can see how that is a negotiation. Yeah, because my characters, particularly my female characters, are on a road to self-actualization, and realizing really who they are and that they can rewrite their story at any time. Because so many of us, like the characters that I'm writing about, they are living a story that they've been written over with by other people, right? In
Yeah,
society or people that they're living with, people they're involved with. So inside my stories, my characters are negotiating with themselves,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
to let go of things or and move forward or to embrace things, to
yeah,
attempt things,
yeah,
to confront people and situations. And there are people in the stories who are pushing back,
yeah,
and so there's definitely that negotiation. And then I think just the very nature of literature is a negotiation with the writer and the reader.
yeah,
The writer is saying, this is what this character thinks and believes, it's plausible, and what is the reader thinking? So through the writing craft and the development of plot, I'm negotiating my way into the heart and of the reader
Yeah.
and negotiating believability.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
that's a really
negotiating
interesting.
our awareness even, Gwen, right? Like you can't help but read when you read that. And for our listeners, I encourage you to go out and grab a copy of the book. And I confess, I'm normally not like historical fiction isn't my genre, but I loved every minute of this book from the beginning to the end. And there was a sort of this empowerment process that came through the reading of the book and watching that sort of growth arc for your characters. I thought it was fabulous.
Thank you.
And on
And
negotiation generally, you'd said at some point that all strength isn't expressed as loud aggressiveness or something like that. And I'm just curious, how do you define strength both in your female characters and what would you say about women today, how we can maybe reclaim quieter forms of power, a different form of power than we've been taught? And just while you're thinking on that, like I think one of the reasons I started Art of Feminine Negotiation is everything we're taught about negotiation and power is about bringing that take no prisoners approach and being the person to talk the loudest and the longest. And I love that you recognize that all strength isn't expressed as that kind of loud, aggressive approach. I'd love your thoughts on that.
well, I mentioned that Mariah lives with her sister Biddy. Biddy is a woman who carries a lot of rage,
Yes.
and she spills that rage on everybody
Yeah.
who comes near her, you know? And so she is assertive. She's very strong in her opinions. She's running the show. She's trying to manipulate her husband overtly and covertly to, get him to do what she wants. She steers him that way. But she does it in a very unlikable way.
Yeah.
She sees that on the outside it looks like power, and she's really using. I'm going to get into something else here as well in this question. Pretty privilege. Of the
Yeah.
two sisters, Mariah and Biddy, Biddy has the pretty privilege. She has the traditionally, beautiful face, that
Yeah.
she can charm her way through life with. But in the story, her pretty privilege is challenged and she loses that leverage.
Yeah.
And then, and I want to say it in a way that doesn't give the story away, but it changes her balance of power.
Yeah.
But then, if we look at Mariah, Mariah is quiet. She's an introvert, most
Yeah.
definitely. She's a thinker. She's a survivor.
Yes.
She's a coper, and she has developed strategies. And when the rubber hits the road, or when the hoofs hit the road, I
Yeah.
guess because it's historical fiction, when the hoofs hit the road, she is much more capable and stronger than she ever knew herself to be, or than anyone else in her family knew her to be.
Yeah.
And she's surprises them and surprises herself with that as well.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. The quieter people are not weaker people.
Yes.
They're taking a different approach to problem solving. And
Uh,
you asked how I would apply that. And then you asked how I would apply that question to myself. I've always been a quiet person, an introvert. I refer to myself as a muller, someone who's to mull things and think things over before I come out with an answer. And I always, for many years, I thought I was kind of a broken person, that there was something really wrong with me because I could not come up with a snap answer to things. I needed to take information away, get more information, and then form an opinion or a thought that I could really stick with. But I have learned in recent years that introversion is not a weakness or anything. It's just a way of being in the world. And that is just very simply how I process thoughts and how I need to think things through. And so I've also, I guess, being a more mature person and becoming more confident in myself, am now willing to ask for what I need. So in my arc, that's like a big development.
yes.
So in advance of a conversation I'm going to have with someone, I will ask for some of the information or where they think the conversation might be going so I can think about it beforehand, because that's what I need, you know.
Well, you're doing a fabulous job here, Gwen. I must say, I'm throwing some pretty heavy zingers at you, and you are navigating this so beautifully.
Well, I
And
love that you're making me think.
and I really want to put a pin for our listeners as well. I'm really glad you touched on this issue about introvert versus that extrovert sort of conditioning that we typically associate with power. And it was an eye opener for me when I had my daughter because I confess I am extroverted, and Jade is not. Jade is definitely an introvert. And I read the book Quiet, which I just loved about that, and it was a beautiful eye opener for me. And it's one of the things I think that really got me exploring this concept of the art of feminine negotiation more. And that what if everything we've been taught about power is wrong? What if we've been duped into this very masculine kind of approach to power? And certainly Mariah so beautifully manifests her strength both internally and externally. She's just a beautiful character. And I wanted to, before I forget, to circle back to something you talked about, that pretty privilege, that Biddy had enjoyed through much of the book. And Mariah, for our listeners here, and this isn't giving away, you find out quite early, but Mariah's face is quite scarred and disfigured as a result of a dog attack when she was younger. And her scarred face, I think, speaks volumes about how women are policed, maybe is the wrong word, but through, judged certainly through our appearance. And I'm wondering how intentional was that as a metaphor for, the negotiation of our own self-worth, the negotiation of our value in society.
Yeah, so I decided to give Mariah a scarred face because I wanted there to be a power differential between the two sisters. And I knew that Biddy would be the more powerful sister, ergo, she has the pretty privilege.
Yeah.
At that time, women being able to meet the standard of beauty for their era was, I should imagine, a large degree of their power. Their ability to please the male gaze gave them leverage. And so that was my thinking there. At that time, women were not recognized as being people under the law.
I know. It's incredible.
We weren't recognized as being people till until much later in a legal sense.
Yeah.
You know, a woman rarely worked outside of the home unless it was in domestic service, did not have a bank account, was not entitled to vote. And so I was thinking, like, what is the power there? And the power was in the appearance. And so I needed to do something to Mariah's appearance that was impossible to disguise and was irrevocable.
Yeah.
And so sadly for Mariah, the scarring by the dog attack is what happened.
Yeah. I thought it was a beautiful commentary, Gwen, on societal issues that we still see today,
Mhm.
frankly, but particularly how she was received as a woman with the scar, the disfigurement on her face, versus how that scar was received when people thought she was a man
Mm-hmm.
later. Totally different reactions and
Yeah.
so consistent. Now, you had mentioned earlier, I want to circle back to about Biddy's rage, and I think you explore female rage both as a destructive, but also it can be a catalyst, right? Like for Mariah, there are times when that rage becomes a catalyst forward. So
Mhm.
I wonder how you sort of channeled that rage and unrest, and what do you believe is the value of a woman learning to negotiate? I guess the question really is what are your thoughts on the value of a woman learning to negotiate with their anger?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a tough question in a way because I want to answer it, but make very clear that I make no judgment on how any woman deals with her female rage. And female rage, of course, being that pent-up frustration that women feel when they are blocked from a safe and fulfilling future. So, as I mentioned earlier, Biddy internalizes that rage and then it bubbles out and it just comes out as bitterness towards other people. She's kind of stuck in the place that she's in, okay?
Yeah.
And Mariah internalizes that, has that rage and frustration, but when presented with the opportunity to be propelled forward by that frustration to take a step to get herself out of her situation, she's able to do that. There's yet another character in the story that I don't think we've mentioned, a sex trade worker who I adore. Her name is Peg.
I love her.
And Peg is a sex trade worker, and in Peg's words, with a plan.
Yeah.
And so she has lots of frustrations towards her situation, her poverty, towards the mistreatment that she receives by clientele, by men in the community. But she keeps her eye on the prize.
Yeah.
She feels the joke will be on them more or less because she's taking their money and she is going to invest that into a business that she wants to begin one day. So she's kind of doing, I guess you could say, in the scope of what she can possibly do, she's doing something constructive. There are a couple of older women who befriend Mariah who take their frustrations and use it as ways in ways to make lessons for younger women, to coach them along, to help them, advise them on how to effectively navigate the patriarchal and societal things that they're up against.
Yeah.
So I think that frustration, it can turn inward and hurt us, or it can turn outward and help us. It can propel us to do the things we need to do for ourselves, and it can also propel us to do things that help other individual women or communities of women in terms of organizing and things of that nature, giving women an opportunity to exercise their voice.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was an earlier question that I answered about introversion, and I didn't really address the power that came from when I learned to use my voice. But it kind of ties in with this answer. So I'll kind of bounce back to that for a second. Once I used my voice and developed my writing, I feel that through writing that we are advocates. It's a form of advocacy for women as well. It's like saying, you see this character, she came from nothing and she was able to push herself, because while Unrest is a feminist adventure, it really has literary leanings, which means there's a lot of introspection and interiority to the characters as well. I'm showing that through the writing. And yeah, and just being able to speak your mind and express yourself in some format does grow your confidence. And in the confidence comes power. And that power passes from me, or, in my example, passes from me to readers, or from me to people who hear a story I tell. And the same goes for everyone. There are a lot of women who are doing the most noble work of all. They're raising the next generation of men and women. And their advocacy is maybe not as visible as some other people out there who are talking on podcasts and things, but they're doing the beautiful work of raising the next generation of men and women with healthy and respectful value of each other, and a belief in equality and such.
Yeah. Well, that was a masterclass on power, and one of the things I thought you did so beautifully and seamlessly in the book, and again for our listeners, I want you to really pay attention to this when you're reading the book and enjoying it, is the different way, like without being at all preachy, you really showed us the different options that were available for us to be able to use that sort of feminine rage that we all experience, and as does everybody in life. And Biddy certainly came out as more toxic versus Mariah versus Peg versus even Clara, right? We had lots of examples. So you showed us rather than told us, these different options and ways. And I think it really gives the reader something to think about. And I hope our listeners were paying attention to that little masterclass on different ways you can choose to show up and, use your voice and use your anger for more productive kinds of sort of powerful remedies. So,
Well,
Gwen,
thank
if
you.
if Unrest had one central message for women, sort of learning to own their space, what would you hope would be the takeaway?
I think the big takeaway is that you can rewrite your story at any time. Like, as I mentioned earlier, so many of us are living a story that other people have told about us. And maybe it's the story of who we were and how we were many years ago, right? And it's perpetuated by family or maybe by a friend circle, or it's a story that you have laid on you, in the workplace when you made a mistake before or something didn't go quite right. And so a lot of times we internalize that story and we keep beating ourselves up with it, or we're keeping ourselves small because we're still squeezing ourselves into the box, like where that story holds us.
Yeah.
But the fact is that we are growing. I'm not the person I was a year ago. I'm certainly not the person I was 15 or 20 years ago. I've been many different versions of myself since then. And so we're the boss of us, and we write our story, and we are who we say we are. And so we need to make that story known. And yeah, and so people have expectations around, how we should be addressed, how we should be cared for, how we should be spoken to, how we should go through life together with them.
Yeah. So beautiful. And I love, and again, for our listeners, I hope you've really been able to capture the incredible messages that we're hearing through. And thank you so much for sharing it, Gwen, about power, about purpose, about presence, for women in the world. So many powerful messages here. So, Gwen, I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? Doesn't have to be about anything we've talked about, just something that was an aha moment for you that made you think or show up differently?
Mm-hmm. Something that really changed my life was when I realized that my mind should work for me. I shouldn't work for my mind. It's kind of like I can be an anxious person, understandably. And sometimes when it comes to the mind, it's like the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
And so I learned strategies through reading and listening to podcasts, even. I learned strategies to turn that around. So, where I used to listen a lot to that little, naysaying inner voice,
Yep.
you cannot, you should not, you will not, I stopped listening to that. If I would feel like super anxious, I stopped attaching meaning to that.
Yeah.
It's just a physiological feeling. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean anything credible that's happening up here, And I learned to build systems and processes into my work, new things I'm going to do that make me anxious or nervous.
Yeah.
I learned to draft plans, systems for how to break those things into little pieces and achieve them a little bit at a time so that I can keep moving forward. Because if I do not do those things, I will be frozen in one spot on my story arc. And I don't deserve that. That would be like being victimized a second time by all the things that happened in my life. And I reject that.
Yeah. Oh, I could not have scripted that better, Gwen, because I often say our first and most important negotiation is negotiating our own mindset. And again, you gave us a little mini masterclass there in the various ways that we can get more intentional about negotiating our mindset. And for our listeners, I want to put in the pin in that, recognize how Gwen approached it. And again, thank you, Gwen, for sharing so transparently. That's an actual negotiation. I mean, whether consciously or subconsciously, she recognized that she needed to negotiate her own mindset and actively set out to do that. So, so beautiful. So, where can people learn more about you, Gwen, and your book?
Well, I'm at gwentuinman.com. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, or you can find me on the Penguin Random House website.
Beautiful. And for our listeners, make sure to grab a copy of the book. I really do encourage you. And I hope you read it for the enjoyment of the book and the story, which is lush and rich and gorgeous. And also that this conversation further inspires you to see some of the really important messages that come through this as well. And when you're grabbing the book, I always encourage support your independent bookstores to the extent that you can, but it's also obviously available in all the big players as well. So, Gwen, thank you so much for sharing today. You've been so raw and authentic and thoughtful and just given us so much to think about. So, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And for our listeners, again, I have no doubt there was just so much value in this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't. And please, I often say, give the gift of sharing, particularly for the women in your life and frankly, the men. I think it's important that we have everybody hear this messaging so that we can start shifting our perspective into more powerful ways across the gender divide, if you will. And before we sign off today, as always, I want to share some ways we can work together. If you are looking to uplevel your negotiation skills, and not just in business, but personally, professionally, negotiating your own mindset, I've got everything from online to group to my signature mastermind or VIP experiences to help you better leverage your innate power so you can get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting, check it out at Art of Feminine Negotiation. Make sure to grab a copy of my book of the same name, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, if you haven't done that, so you can up level to negotiate your best life. And that is a wrap for this episode. Until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and you can start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.